Step into the timeless story of hope and redemption. Welcome to God's story. Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. In this opening episode, we travel back through the centuries to a time when whispers of prophecy ignited hope in a world longing for salvation. Together, we'll uncover the divine promises that set the stage for the greatest story ever told, a story destined to transform the world forever.
The fire crackled softly in the stillness of the desert night, sending up brief sparks like fleeting prayers lost in the vast heavens above. The old shepherd sat close to the flames, his hands, worn and rough as the earth's rocks, stretched toward the warmth. His shoulders, draped in a tattered cloak, sagged under the weight of countless years spent wandering across barren fields. The orange light played across his face, casting shadows into the deep lines etched there, a map of time, hardship, and stories untold. Above him, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, scattered with stars that blinked with eternal patience. The stars weren't just lights to him. They were companions, silent witnesses to his life and to the lives of those who had come before. Tonight, they seemed closer, their cold beauty a stark contrast to the flickering heat of the fire. A faint wind stirred, carrying the dry scent of earth and grass. It brushed against the herd of sheep resting nearby, their bodies huddled together for warmth. Their rhythmic breathing blended with the night's quiet hum, a harmony so subtle it could be mistaken for silence. The shepherd glanced at them, his gaze lingering as if counting each one in his mind, ensuring that none had strayed. He looked up again, his weathered eyes searching the horizon where the darkness swallowed everything. For a moment he seemed lost, not in despair, but in a trance that carried him far beyond the present. His hand reached for a small stick, and he stirred the embers, watching them glow briefly before fading back into the ash. "Boy!" he said, his voice a low rumble breaking the night's stillness. His words drifted slowly, deliberate, as if each carried weight beyond their sound. A young boy sat opposite him, his small hands busy with the fire, his face illuminated by its glow. The boy looked up, eyes wide, reflecting curiosity and an unspoken respect for the elder. "Do you know," the old man continued, "before the light came to Bethlehem, the world was wrapped in darkness, thick as this night and just as cold." The boy said nothing, but his gaze held steady, drinking in every word as though they were drops of water on a parched tongue. He didn't yet understand the depth of the old man's words, but there was no need to. The story, like the stars above, would linger in his heart until the day came when he could see his full brilliance. "There were promises," the shepherd said, his voice softening, "not like the kind men make and break, but promises so solid they felt like stone. They were carried across generations, from father to son, mother to daughter, whispered into the ears of children just like you." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes catching the firelight. "We are small, boy, shepherds, forgotten by the world, but even we are part of these promises." He stopped, gesturing upward with a weathered hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "They aren't just for kings or priests. They're for you and me, for those who watch and wait." The boy's hands stilled, resting on his knees. His breath seemed to catch as the old man's voice dropped to a near whisper. "We waited," the shepherd continued, "through cold nights and barren days, through years when the heavens seemed silent, and still the stars held their vigil. They spoke without words, carrying those promises like a flame passed through the ages. He fell silent then, his gaze fixed on a single star that shone brighter than the rest. Its light felt different tonight, not distant or detached, but close, as if it too was listening. The boy followed the man's gaze and shivered, though not from the cold. The old man's words had stirred something in him, something he couldn't name but felt deeply. The fire crackled again, drawing them both back into its warmth. "Look up, boy," the shepherd said softly, almost to himself. "Look at the stars. They are the keepers of our story. And tonight they remind us we are not alone." The wind shifted, carrying the faintest hint of change in its touch. The shepherd leaned back, his old bones creaking like the branches of an ancient tree. He didn't say more, but his silence spoke volumes, as though the night itself had taken up the tale. The boy sat quietly, his eyes still fixed on the sky. Somewhere, in the vastness above, a star gleamed just a little brighter, as if it too awaited what was to come. Before the light of Bethlehem shone across the world, the promises of old were carried like whispers in the wind, the old shepherd began, his voice steady, but laced with a gravity that seemed to anchor the words to the earth itself. His eyes, pale and clouded by age, reflected the golden flicker of the fire before him. He spoke as if drawing from a well so deep that its depths could never truly be plumbed. "These promises weren't like the kind we make to one another," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "They were etched in stone, carved into the hearts of our people, passed from father to son, mother to daughter. They were the only light we had in the darkness of the centuries." The boy across the fire, no more than 12 years old, listened with the quiet intensity only a child could muster. His small hands rested on his knees, his face illuminated by the firelight, a mix of awe and curiosity written across his features. The old shepherd watched him, his heart stirring with a faint but certain hope that this boy might carry the story forward when his own voice was silenced by time. "Do you see those stars?" The old man lifted a hand toward the heavens, his fingers trembling slightly as they pointed to the shimmering canopy above. "Each one is a reminder. Each one is a witness to the promises of God. They've been there, unchanged, through every storm, every trial, every moment of despair. I open this door to you with the most hope, that the promises would be fulfilled." The boy's gaze followed the shepherd's hand, his wide eyes searching the sky as though hoping to see those promises written among the constellations. "What kind of promises?" the boy asked softly, his voice hesitant but eager. The shepherd smiled, a faint curve of his weathered lips that carried both sorrow and joy. "Promises of hope, child, of light breaking through the shadows, of a Savior who would come to set the world right." He paused, his hand dropping back to his lap, where it rested like a stone. "For centuries we've waited. We've told these stories again and again, not because we saw them come true, but because we believed they would." The fire crackled between them, the sound filling the brief silence like the heartbeat of the night. The shepherd's voice grew softer, almost as if he were speaking to the fire itself. "You know, the stars weren't always so clear. There were nights when the clouds hung heavy, when it seemed as though the promises had been forgotten. But even then, even when we couldn't see the stars, we knew they were there, just like the promises. The boy shifted, leaning forward slightly, his breath fogging in the cold air. "And now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What about now?" The shepherd looked at him, the weight of years visible in his gaze. "Now," he said, his voice firm but quiet, "the stars are clearer than they've ever been, the promises are closer than we've ever known, and soon, very soon, they will shine brighter than all the stars in the heavens combined." The boy sat back, his mind whirling with the weight of what he'd heard. The shepherd returned his gaze to the fire, its flames a reflection of the hope that had carried him through countless cold nights like this one. He said no more, but the silence that followed was richer than words, filled with the unspoken truth of centuries of waiting and believing. Above them, the stars continued their vigil, ancient and eternal, as if they too waited for the fulfillment of the story that had been written in their light. The hill stood barren, its dry earth cracked under the weight of relentless sun and time. Isaiah climbed it slowly, each step deliberate, as though he carried the burdens of his people in every movement. His robe, tattered and dust-streaked, whispered against the ground, while the staff in his hand tapped a steady rhythm, marking his ascent. The air was still, heavy with the scent of drought and despair. Around him, the land lay desolate, a portrait of a nation fractured by war, pain, and longing. At the summit he stopped. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, a blur of scorched earth and jagged hills. Yet Isaiah's gaze wasn't fixed on the emptiness around him. It was lifted upward, toward the heavens. His eyes burned not with the fire of anger, but with the fierce clarity of a man who had glimpsed something beyond the veil of this broken world. Below, a crowd began to gather, their faces etched with exhaustion and sorrow. These were his people, scattered, displaced, their lives reduced to fragments. They stood in silence, their eyes turning to Isaiah with the faintest flicker of hope. For years he had spoken to them, warned them, and consoled them. Today, though, his voice would carry a different message. Isaiah raised his hands, his staff in one and his palm open in the other, as if to gather the weight of heaven and earth into his words. The wind stirred, faint but purposeful, curling dust around his feet. His voice, when it came, was deep and resonant, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "The people walking in darkness," he began, each syllable weighted with certainty, "have seen a great light." His words hung in the air, trembling with power, as though they themselves were alive out of those living in the land of deep darkness. "A light has dawned." The crowd stirred, whispers breaking through the silence like leaves rustling in the wind. Their eyes, dulled by hardship, brightened imperceptibly. Isaiah continued, his voice unwavering, building like a wave that refused to break. "For to us a child is born," he proclaimed, the words rising with an almost musical cadence. "To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." The crowd grew still again. the enormity of his words settling over them like the shadow of a mighty tree. Isaiah's gaze swept over them, his voice softening but losing none of its conviction. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. A child in the crowd tugged at her mother's hand, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She clung to the words like a lifeline, even as doubt tried to creep in. Could this promise, this vision truly be for them? For her? Isaiah's final words fell like stones into a still pond, rippling outward. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. The crowd didn't cheer or cry out. They stood in quiet reverence, the gravity of Isaiah's prophecy sinking deep into their souls. Around them, the desolation of the land remained unchanged, but something imperceptible had shifted. It was as if the air itself carried a promise, one that would endure long after Isaiah's voice was gone. Isaiah lowered his hands, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had spoken. He turned and began his descent, his staff once again tapping a steady rhythm against the ground. Behind him, the people began to murmur, their words weaving together into a fragile tapestry of hope. Above, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the barren earth, a reminder that even in darkness the light was coming. The crowd lingered at the base of the hill, their faces turned upward, eyes still fixed on the place where Isaiah had stood moments ago. The echoes of his words remained in the air, filling the barren landscape with a sense of something they had not felt in years. Hope. It was fragile, like a single flame flickering against the wind, but it was there, casting its light over the shadows of despair that clung to their help. A young woman, her hands roughened by labor, clutched her child tightly to her chest. The child, no older than 2, squirmed slightly, reaching up to pat his mother's tear-streaked face. He smiled faintly, her lips trembling as she whispered the words of Isaiah to herself. "Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God." Her voice cracked, but she held on to the words as though they were a lifeline. An elderly man leaned on his cane nearby, his weathered face turned skyward. His eyes, clouded by age, shimmered with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd see the day," he murmured to no one in particular. "A child, born to bring peace." His voice caught and he swallowed hard, the weight of years pressing heavily on his shoulders. Yet, in that moment, he stood a little straighter, as if Isaiah's prophecy had lifted some invisible burden. The murmur of the crowd grew, soft at first, like the tentative notes of a melody searching for its rhythm. Mothers repeated the words to their children, who listened with wide-eyed wonder. Fathers exchanged quiet glances, their expressions a mix of skepticism and longing. For too long, they had lived under the weight of war and exile, their days marked by loss and uncertainty. And yet, this promise, this vision of a Prince of Peace, began to take root, like a seed planted in dry soil. "Do you think it's true?" a young boy asked, tugging on his father's sleeve. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though he feared the question might shatter the fragile hope that had settled over them. The father knelt beside him, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "But I believe it could be." He glanced toward the horizon. where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. And sometimes believing is enough. The boy nodded, his gaze following his father's. The light of the setting sun seemed to mingle with the words of Isaiah, casting the barren land in a warmth that felt almost sacred. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of shared hope. A woman stepped forward, her voice clear and strong as she spoke. He said it would happen. A child born to us, given to us, a light in the darkness. Her words carried the weight of conviction, and the crowd fell silent, their attention shifting toward her. "We've waited so long," she continued, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But maybe the waiting is almost over." The elderly man with the cane nodded, his voice trembling as he added, "The Lord Almighty will accomplish this. That's what he said." He looked around, his gaze meeting those of the people nearest to him. "And I believe him." The crowd began to disperse slowly, their steps lighter than when they had gathered. Parents carried their children on their backs, whispering the prophecy to them as though it were a bedtime story. Friends walked together, their quiet conversations punctuated by glimmers of laughter, small, hesitant, but real. The hill stood empty now, the barren earth marked only by the faint impressions of Isaiah's footsteps. Above, the first stars appeared, their light steady and unwavering. They seemed to echo the promise spoken that day, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the light would come. The marketplace buzzed with muted tension, the air heavy with the weariness of a people living under the weight of impending exile. Merchants called out half-heartedly, their voices lacking the energy they once carried, while mothers ushered their children away from the dusty paths of the city gates. Amid this scene, Micah stood, his figure distinct against the chaos, his presence commanding, yet unassuming. His robe, simple and coarse, fluttered lightly in the faint breeze, and his staff was planted firmly in the ground beside him. He was no king, no warrior, but his words had the power to stir the hearts of the people. As he stepped forward, the murmurs of the crowd quieted, their faces turning toward him with a mixture of curiosity and longing. They had heard him speak before, and though his messages often carried warnings of judgment, today there was something different in his stance, an air of quiet assurance. "Listen," he began, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the noise like a blade through cloth. "Though we are scattered, though our enemies surround us, the Lord has not forgotten his people." His words hung in the air, gathering strength as the crowd leaned in, their attention sharpening. Micah raised his hand, gesturing toward the distant horizon. "Bethlehem," he said, Bethlehem, rolling off his tongue with reverence. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Bethlehem, this small town, known more for its shepherds than its significance, seemed an unlikely choice for greatness. Hear this," Micah continued, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "You, Bethlehem, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." His voice carried an authority that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them, as if the earth itself bore witness to the truth of his words. The crowd stirred, whispers breaking out among them. A young man, his tunic patched and worn, turned to his companion. "Bethlema?" he murmured, Disbelief etched across his face. What ruler could come from such a place? Micah heard him, and a faint smile flickered across his weathered face. "Do not look at the size of the place," he said, his tones softer now, as though addressing the young man directly. "Look at the promise. The Lord chooses not the mighty but the humble, not the grand but the faithful. Bethlehem is chosen, not because of its greatness, but because of its heart." An older woman in the crowd nodded slowly, her hands clasped tightly around a small basket. "He speaks the truth," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It has always been the small and the overlooked that the Lord uses." Micah's voice rose again, drawing their attention back to him. "The ruler who will come is not like those who seek power for themselves. He will shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they will live securely, for his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of his words settling over them like a warm mantle. In their minds they could see Bethlehem, not as the small, unremarkable town they knew, but as a place where something extraordinary would unfold. The idea sparked something within them, a fragile yet undeniable hope. And I lowered his hand, and his gaze softening as he looked out at his people. "Hold on to this promise," he said gently. "For though the days ahead may be dark, the light will come, and it will come from Bethlehem." As he turned to leave, the crowd parted silently, their expressions a mixture of reverence and quiet determination. The young man who had questioned earlier stood rooted in place, his eyes fixed on the distant hills. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that something greater than his own struggles might be at work. Bethlehem, small and unassuming, stood waiting in the distance, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and, though its streets were quiet, its role in the story of salvation was about to shine brighter than anyone could imagine. The evening air carried a strange stillness, as if the very land was holding its breath. The words of Micah echoed long after he had departed, weaving their way into the hearts and minds of those who had gathered. Bethlehem, humble, overlooked Bethlehem, had been named, not as an afterthought, but as the chosen place. The crowd that had listened to him now dispersed, each person carrying the weight of his prophecy like a secret flame, small yet impossible to extinguish. A mother led her young daughter down the dusty path toward home. The child's small feet kicked up puffs of dry earth, her curious eyes glancing up at her mother. "Mama?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with wonder. "Is it true? Will a king really come from Bethlehem?" The mother hesitated, her hand tightening slightly around her daughter's. She glanced toward the horizon, where the distant silhouette of Bethlehem rested under the first stars of the evening. "It's what the prophet said," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. "And if he speaks the words of the Lord, then it must be true." The child fell silent, her gaze fixed on the stars, as if searching for confirmation among their unchanging patterns. The mother watched her, a faint smile touching her lips. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to believe, not fully, not without reservations, but enough to feel the faint stirrings of hope. In the marketplace, a group of men gathered around a flickering oil lamp. Their faces were lined with years of toil, their hands calloused from labor. They spoke in low tones, their words cautious yet charged with an energy that has been absent for far too long. "Bethlehem," one of them said, shaking his head. "It's hard to imagine something so great coming from a place so small." Another man, older and with a beard streaked with grey, leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Isn't that how the Lord works?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. "He takes what we overlook, what we think is unworthy, and he makes it the cornerstone." The younger men nodded slowly, their expressions softening. They didn't fully understand, but they could feel the truth in the elders' words. The promise of Bethlehem had stirred something in them, a sense of anticipation they hadn't felt in years. Further away, a shepherd stood on a hill, his flock grazing lazily in the twilight. He had heard Micah's words earlier that day, and they had stayed with him, circling in his mind like the stars now beginning to emerge. He looked toward Bethlehem, his faint lights flicking in the distance, and felt a pull he couldn't explain. "Small Bethlehem," he murmured to himself, his voice barely louder than the rustle of the wind. "Chosen for something so grand." He didn't understand why, but he didn't need to. The shepherd had spent his life watching over his flock, trusting in things unseen. He knew how to wait, how to anticipate the unfolding of something greater. As night fell fully, the scattered people of Judah carried Micah's prophecy with them. Some whispered it to their children as they tucked them into bed, their voices low but filled with an unfamiliar warmth. Others repeated the words quietly to themselves as they sat by their fires, staring into the flames as if seeking answers. In Bethlehem itself, life went on as it always had. Its narrow streets and humble homes showed no sign of the role it would soon play. Yet, even in its stillness, there was a sense of waiting, a quiet hum in the air, a subtle shift in the rhythm of life. The town was small, but its heart was steady, its spirit patient. Above, the stars shone with their eternal brilliance, bearing silent witness to the anticipation spreading across the land. They twinkled over Bethlehem, their light gentle yet resolute, as if to say, "Wait, the promise will come." The old shepherd sat by the fire once again, its golden glow casting long shadows across his weathered face. The crackling flames mirrored the flickers of memory that played in his mind. Around him, the younger shepherds leaned in, their faces illuminated by the light and their eyes reflecting the curiosity and awe that only youth could hold. Tonight, his tale would weave together the threads of time, connecting prophecies spoken across centuries into a tapestry of divine promise. "Have you ever wondered," he began, his voice low and steady, "how all the pieces fit together, how the words of Isaiah and Micah, spoken so long ago, can lead us to a single truth?" The youngest shepherd, barely out of boyhood, shifted closer, his knees tucked beneath him. "I thought they were just stories," he said hesitantly, his voice small but filled with genuine wonder. "Stories we tell to give ourselves hope." The old man chuckled softly, a sound rich with both amusement and understanding. "Stories, yes," he said, nodding. "But more than that, they are promises. And promises, true promises, are never broken." He leaned forward, the firelight dancing in his eyes. Isaiah spoke of a great light, he continued, a light for those walking in darkness, a child born not to rule with a heavy hand, but to bring peace, a wonderful counselor, a mighty God. Do you see? He wasn't speaking of just any child. He was speaking of the one to come, the one who would change everything. The younger men nodded slowly, their expressions thoughtful. The old shepherd let his words settle before continuing, his tone becoming almost reverent. "And Micah," he said, gesturing toward the horizon as though pointing to something unseen, "Micah told us where. Not Jerusalem, not some grand city filled with wealth and power, but Bethlehem, small, humble Bethlehem." He paused, his gaze shifting upward to the stars. They glittered like tiny lanterns against the vast expanse of the night, steady and silent. "Why Bethlehem?" he mused aloud, more to himself than to his audience. "Why would the Lord choose such a place for something so great?" The oldest of the younger shepherds, a man who had seen enough seasons to understand the world's harshness, but still held on to hope, spoke up. "Because it's not the size of the place that matters," he said quietly. "It's the promise." The old man smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Exactly," he said. "The Lord doesn't look at what the world sees. He looks at the heart, and He fulfills His promises in ways that no one expects." The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed with its warm, rhythmic song. Around them the sheep rested peacefully, their soft breaths blending with the night's stillness. The old shepherd glanced at the young men, their faces filled with quiet awe. "Isaiah and Micah," he said finally, his voice soft but firm, spoke of the same promise. One saw the light, the other saw the place, and together their words guide us. They remind us that the Lord's plans are not bound by time or place. They are woven into the fabric of history, waiting to be revealed. Again. He leaned back, his gaze once again drawn to the stars. "The prophecies are not just words," he murmured. "They are the light in the darkness, the map for the journey, and if we hold on to them, they will lead us to the truth." The younger shepherds sat in silence, their thoughts turning over the old man's words. Above them, the stars continued their quiet vigil, as if listening to the tale and bearing witness to the promises that had yet to unfold. The fire had burnt lower now, the flames reduced to glowing embers, but its warmth lingered, wrapping the shepherds in a cocoon of quiet reflection. The old shepherd's voice had grown softer, not from weariness, but from the weight of the truth he sought to convey. Around him the younger men and boys sat motionless, their attention held as though the very air had thickened with meaning. "For generations," the old man began, his gaze fixed on the embers, "our people have carried these promises. We've repeated the words of the prophets, even when the world seemed to grow darker with each passing year." His voice faltered slightly, a tremor of emotion passing through it. "And yet, we've held on." A boy spoke up, his voice hesitant but filled with earnestness. "Why?" he asked. "Why hold on when the promises haven't come true yet?" The old shepherd looked at him, his eyes deep and kind. "Because," he said, "faith isn't about seeing, it's about trusting. The prophets didn't speak of things they had already seen. They spoke of things they believed would come. They saw the light before it arrived. And so must we. The boy nodded, his brow furrowed as he absorbed the words. Nearby, one of the older shepherds shifted slightly, his rough hands resting on his knees. "But it's been so long," he said quietly. "How do we know we're not just fooling ourselves?" The old man's gaze turned upward toward the vast expanse of stars that glittered in the night sky. "Do you see those stars?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of the question. "They've been there for as long as we've been alive, longer. They've seen kingdoms rise and fall, seen the world change 1,000 times over, and yet they remain." He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "The stars remind us that some things are eternal, and the promises of the Lord are like those stars. They don't fade even when we can't see them through the clouds." A hush fell over the group. The only sounds were the faint crackle of the embers and the soft rustling of the sheep nearby. The old shepherd leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a secret with the night itself. "We don't hold on to the promises because they're easy," he said. "We hold on to them because they're true, because they're all we have, and because we know, deep in our hearts, that they come from a God who does not break his word." One of the younger men, his face shadowed by the dying firelight, nodded slowly. "So we wait," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We wait, and we believe." The old man smiled, a faint but genuine curve of his weathered lips. "Yes," he said simply, "we wait, and in our waiting we find strength." The group fell silent again, their thoughts turning inward as the night deepened. Above them the stars shone brighter, their steady light a silent affirmation of the old man's words. The promises of the prophets, carried through the ages, seemed to hang in the air, like an unseen thread connecting the shepherds to a story far greater than themselves. The old shepherd leaned back, his body weary, but his spirit unbowed. "The Messiah will come," he said softly, as if speaking to the embers, "and when he does, we'll know that every moment of waiting, every prayer whispered in the dark, was worth it." The fire crackled faintly, a gentle reminder of its presence. The shepherds remained where they were, their hearts heavy with the weight of the promise, yet lightened by the hope it carried. Above them, the stars continued their eternal watch, a testament to the faith that had brought them this far and the light that was yet to come. The fire had nearly burned out, its once vivid flames reduced to faintly glowing embers that pulsed like the heartbeat of the earth. The old shepherd sat in its dim light, his hands resting on his knees, his shoulders bent not from the weight of the years, but from the burden of the story he carried. Around him, the younger shepherds waited, their breaths held in anticipation, their eyes fixed on the man who had become the keeper of their shared hope. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the group before settling on the horizon. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady, each word carrying the weight of a truth too deep for simple explanation. "The darkness. It's everywhere, isn't it? Pressing in, trying to swallow everything whole?" The younger men nodded, their expression somber. One of them glanced toward the sheep huddled nearby, their soft breaths visible in the cool night air. "It's always there," he murmured, almost to himself. The old shepherd turned his eyes to the sky, where the stars shimmered faintly against the vast expanse of black. "But the darkness doesn't win," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Do you know why?" The youngest boy, barely a teenager, leaned forward, his face alight with curiosity. "Why?" he whispered. The shepherd smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. "Because there's always a light," he said. "Sometimes it's small, so small you might miss it if you're not looking. But it's there, and that's all it takes to push back the dark." He leaned forward, his gaze sweeping across the group. "The promises we've been given," he said. "They're like that light. They remind us that no matter how heavy the darkness feels, it's never final. The light always returns." One of the older men, his beard streaked with grey, nodded slowly. "You mean the Messiah," he said, his voice rough but reverent. "The one Isaiah and Micah spoke of." The old shepherd met his gaze, his expression solemn. "Yes," he said simply, "the Messiah. He's the light we're waiting for, and he's coming. I don't know when, but I know it's soon. I can feel it." The group fell silent, the crackling of the embers the only sound between them. The stars above seemed brighter now, their light piercing through the night with a quiet resilience. The shepherd's voice softened, carrying an almost dreamlike quality. "You see, the promises aren't just for kings or priests," he said. "They're for us, shepherds, fishermen, the ones the world forgets. The Messiah isn't coming to sit on a throne of gold. He's coming for the lost, the broken, the ones who've walked through the darkest valleys." The youngest boy looked up at him, his eyes wide. "But why us?" he asked, his voice trembling with both wonder and doubt. "Why would he come for people like us?" The shepherd's smile deepened, his weathered face glowing with a quiet certainty. "Because that's who he is," he said. "He doesn't look at what the world sees. He sees the heart, and he chooses the humble, the overlooked, the ones who are ready to believe." He sat back, his gaze returning to the embers. "So hold on to the promises," he said, his voice steady and strong, "even when it's hard, even when the darkness feels too heavy, because the light is coming, and when it does, it will change everything." The shepherds nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of awe and determination. Above them, the stars continued their silent vigil, their light unwavering against the darkness. And as the old shepherd leaned back, his spirit unbowed, the night seemed to hum with quiet anticipation, as though all of creation was waiting for the moment when the promises would be fulfilled.
Thank you for watching the first episode of Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation on God's story. If you were inspired, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a bit of hope this season, and leave your thoughts below. In our next episode, we'll witness a pivotal moment, the angel's message to Mary that would set everything in motion. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. See you next episode.